All right, I think we can get started now. Hello, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of RENCI's Accelerating Collaborative Team Science webinar series. I'm Brandy Farlow. I'm a research proposal and documentation specialist at RENCI, and I will also be your host today. So today we have a panel of experts from various UNC Chapel Hill institutes with us. I'm excited to introduce them, but first I wanted to highlight a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. So we're going to go ahead and show you our agenda real quick, and we'll take a moment to introduce you to our panelists, hear more about them, and then we'll get started with a few questions they have prepared to answer, which will lead into a larger conversation prompted by questions from the audience. As we get started with this webinar, I do want to note that we understand this is an important topic to many of you, and we have had an unusually high number of questions submitted in advance of the webinar. I'm also more than sure that more will come up as we proceed. We will obviously not have time to get to all of these questions, but we will do our best to address them as efficiently as possible. Please also note that while we recognize the importance of these questions in the current environment and will address them from that standpoint as much as possible, there may be some questions that we simply cannot answer. And we also do want to remind everyone of the importance of these conversations and mindfulness about the relationships between science and the public, regardless of the political climate or administration. The current situation is built on a history of misunderstandings and missed opportunities, which is something that we can all learn to address in big and small ways from our own labs and institutes and with our teams. That said, our ability to build trust and engage general audiences in our science to help people understand and be excited for the act of scientific discovery and all the potentials it holds for our future allows science to have a lasting impact. And we want to ensure we keep that idea central to today's conversation. So some housekeeping items before we meet the panel. We have disabled Zoom Q&A for attendees. All of our questions related to today's presentation should be placed in Easy Retro, which is our crowdsourcing Q&A platform. We'll go ahead and share the link in chat shortly here. You may find the platform intuitive and easy to use, and if so, you are certainly welcome to add questions and comments throughout the panel discussion. Please note, though, we will share instructions and the link again after our moderated discussion. So let's take a quick look at how we define team science. Many folks use this definition from the National Cancer Institute. Team science is a collaborative effort to address scientific challenges that leverages the strengths and expertise of professionals, oftentimes trained in different fields. Although traditional single investigator-driven approaches are ideal for many scientific endeavors, coordinated teams of investigators with diverse skills and knowledge may be especially helpful for tackling complex scientific and societal problems. So why are we addressing this in a team science webinar? Well, today's discussion involves efforts to engage the public meaningfully in science. While it's a bit of a stretch on more traditional concepts related to team science, if we can view individuals in our community as part of our team, there is a unique opportunity to enhance the research process through a focus on community-driven priorities. But broadening how we define a team in the sciences to include not just those in our lab or our institute, but also community members, policymakers, and other stakeholders with differing expertise that they can bring to the table allows us to conduct more collaborative, impactful, and socially relevant research. But we can also work to break down existing barriers, which benefits all of us. So without further delay, let's meet our panelists. I'll call on each of the panelists separately and ask them to tell a little bit about themselves and their background in research. I'd like to kick it off with Cassandra.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. My name is Cassandra Davis. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Public Policy here at UNC Chapel Hill. A little bit about my research. I focus on the ways in which that hazards create inequalities or widen inequalities with marginalized or historically marginalized or socially marginalized groups. I work a lot with communities. I consider that my research and my work is community-based, and I also work a ton with different agencies. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Layla, you are up next.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Layla Dowdy. I am the Director of Communications for the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research at UNC Chapel Hill. I am not a researcher, but I've spent 20 years supporting researchers and scientists. My role at UNC involves articulating our strategies and priorities for research administration, and I also lead a team that covers the breadth of research activity at Carolina. So we profile a lot of different researchers all the time, including Dr. Davis a few times. So really excited to be here with you today.
Wonderful, thank you. Brian, you are next.
Great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Brian Blanton. I'm actually an oceanographer doing a lot of coastal hazards simulation and analysis work. I focus a lot on more on the science side, and then how to, I think a little bit about how to quantify and characterize uncertainty in pretty complex systems. So I'm very interested in this whole topic of how you communicate these various complex outcomes to other groups.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, Julie.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm a senior research scientist here at the Renaissance Computing Institute, and I practice team science through a lot of my collaborations looking at primate genetics and skin microbiome research. And I'm also affiliated with the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, so you'll see a lot of that thread through some of my answers because I conduct participatory science projects, which is a type of team science where I engage the public in both human and animal health by getting them to contribute to some of these research projects and then give back some of the answers or some information short term and have a bigger discussion and do a lot of science communication through that aspect.
Perfect. Thank you guys for those introductions. We're going to go ahead and get started with the discussion now. So I will kick this off. So I'm going to ask questions. I will address them to one researcher to start, and then if anybody else wants to jump in, please feel free to. Okay. So we'll start with a question for Cassandra. Some communities distrust science more than others. What ethical considerations should researchers keep in mind when engaging the public, but particularly when approaching these communities?
Yes. So I kind of heard the beginning of the question. It sounded like you broke up a little bit, but I'm assuming, can you repeat the end of it? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. So just to repeat the whole question, some communities distrust science more than others. What ethical considerations should researchers keep in mind when engaging the public, but particularly when approaching these communities?
Oh yeah, no, it's a great question. And I work a lot with trust, and as I said earlier in my introduction, the work that I do is really kind of community-based oriented, and trust is the beginning. One thing that we kind of talk about is that there's like this idea that as an academic, you go into a space, you talk to another person, and instantly we are hitting it off and we're trusting each other. That's not at all how trust works. And in fact, I have to realize that when I go into a community, that I have to go in with the assumption of distrust. I have to go in with the thought that there's a chance that unintended, but a researcher before me had did something that caused some bit of distrust to occur. And so some considerations that individuals should have is understanding that rebuilding that trust absolutely takes time, which is conflicting, right? Like our funders don't want to hear about that. Sometimes our universities or research hubs don't want to hear about that. But that if the ethical consideration is, if I'm really interested in working and building a relationship with this community and trying to get this data, I have to realize that the timeline that I am trying to follow will completely get disrupted. Yeah, I guess that's kind of my quick answer.
All right, that's fair. Does anybody else want to chime in on this one? All right. Well, we can move on to the next question, which I have for Layla. Layla, how can researchers effectively engage with policymakers to ensure science informs public decisions while maintaining scientific independence?
This is a great question and very timely. I'll answer it first from the institutional perspective. So if you are a researcher at an institution like UNC Chapel Hill, there are offices that can facilitate that engagement on your behalf. So we have an Office of Federal Affairs and we have an Office of State Affairs, and they can coordinate that engagement for you, including up to testimonials on Capitol Hill, but also staff visits to campus or to their offices. And then also professional associations are a great venue too, an avenue to engage and coordinate, impact storytelling with these groups.
Perfect. And opening it to anyone else who might want to chime in.
That's the professional hat. The personal hat is,
Oh, yes.
you're a US citizen. It is within your rights to visit these folks and call them and email them and send them letters as much and as often as you'd like.
Absolutely. Good reminder to have right now. All right. Anyone else? Okay. I will direct the next question to Brian. What roles should social media and digital platform strategies play in modern scientific communication? And what about in community trust in science?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a hard question to answer in some ways. I think one thing to keep in mind is that, trust in anything, whether it's science or some other area, can really only be established by those who are interested in the trust, sort of operation or communication. And I think it's hard to convince people that are not interested in trust that they should be interested in trust. But from the social media standpoint, I mean, this might be one of the only tools that we can use to really quickly get information out to a whole variety of different types of communities, peoples with different thoughts about subjects. But there's definitely two edges to that particular sword. I mean, one is that whole apparatus is actually a key tool in the creation and propagation of misinformation and disinformation in the first place. The good side of that sword is that I think that it can be effectively used to combat that other side and to make inroads again with people who are interested or communities that are interested in knowing more about a particular topic. But I think that one thing I have recently read is that sharing scientific findings becomes a lot easier, right, with social media. And that's actually true. But it sort of bypasses a pretty critical gatekeeping mechanism, which is essentially peer review, however you feel about the peer review process. In most cases, or many cases, it's used to really kind of double check things and make sure that that the messages or the outcomes are articulated well and even correctly in some cases. So we don't want to bypass that. We want to be able to use it to amplify the right messages. But I don't think it's a replacement for something like journal publications or that kind of outlet, because that's again where a lot of the details are, and some of those details don't matter to communities. So that's not the purpose of the journal article really. But there's no question that we can effectively address a lot of the or try to address a lot of the communication issues and information challenges out there through the digital technologies.
Wonderful. Thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in on this one? All right. I will move forward then. And Julie, the next question is for you. How can scientific institutions encourage researchers to prioritize community engagement rather than treating it as an optional or secondary to publication?
Great and challenging question. Some researchers love talking to the public, engaging them, and so they do it seamlessly. Others are not as open to that. Research typically we've prioritized at a lot of institutions. How many grants did you get? How many publications do you have? What have you done to get your information in the scientific community? And so I think it really is on the institution to start figuring out how do we actually prioritize the need to communicate science broadly, not just to the scientific community, but also to the general public. And so putting some metrics in, generally faculty and staff get evaluated annually. So ways to put in some metrics to say, hey, what did you do to engage and communicate your research findings to the community more broadly? Those are great ways. Offering professional development where you can actually give some science communication training to people, find ways to offer opportunities to engage with the public and the community, because that's really what I think would be valuable to get everybody out there. And then, with that training, then they can actually do a good job of engaging and explaining what the research was. So I'm sure there are many other ways, but those are some ways where the institution can actually take some impetus and say, this is, valuable to us, and we find it valuable to the community too.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. I will give the next question to Cassandra. How do you navigate situations where scientific consensus conflicts with deeply held community beliefs or values?
So this question is really a question that I have been struggling with within probably in the last 12 months. I took a fantastic team of researchers, undergraduate students, graduate students. We went down to Louisiana about a year and a couple months ago to talk to community leaders in spaces that were ravaged by the latest hurricane. I mean, insert hurricane name here. And the research, the science consensus is that these places are underwater, that the next storm could literally erase these towns or these communities, and that what the research recently has said that there should be conversations to encourage these places and these communities to move. What we discovered in this very kind of short but impactful trip is that consent, like using what is commonplace in science, having the data to back all this up does not translate, especially as we were working with people who were connected to a freedom town. If anyone in the audience knows what that is these are towns that were created by newly freed people right after the Civil War, that they came together with their money and they purchased a plot of land. So there's a lot of history in this spaces. And to go in and say, hey, the data suggests that your community, your culture will be washed away. It's time for you to move, did not go over well, as you all can imagine. So through the experience of really getting our, for lack of any scientific word, our face cracked by the community, having a real humble moment. Um, and also building fantastic relationships with our newfound aunts and uncles in the space. My colleagues, Simona Golden, I don't know if she's out there, but we created a new theory, a framework. And this framework is around a just recovery. What does that look like? We've spoke to a number of agencies about this theory, and we were asked to start to think of professional development that we could go in and support organizations as they're traveling into communities to have this conversation. Because the current research not only says that these communities are going away, but the map and the layout is you need to tell people to move. We know that history tells us that that's not a good solution. And so we've decided to pull up additional research and team up with other places. We have a colleague that's in Puerto Rico that's saying the exact same thing. We have colleagues in Alaska that are saying the same thing. That this conversation of following what the science is saying and applying that to communities that have long-term historical connections to their spaces, regardless of, we're seeing this in Indigenous groups and Black groups and Latinx groups, we're seeing this in white groups. Doesn't matter. People are connected to their space if they have a strong social place attachment. These old metrics don't work. So we're in this space now of trying to create a new strategy of what does a just recovery look like? And how do you have a conversation with the community that is uplifting and building? And we're still following the sciences, where as scientists, we're able to say that an old way of doing something doesn't work and doesn't apply anymore. So that's something that I am currently wrestling with, but it's a fun new challenge.
Sounds like a really neat approach to it, though. All right. Next question is going to go to Brian. How do you approach communicating scientific uncertainty without undermining public confidence in the research process?
This is very hard. There's no question about that. I mean, uncertainty sort of generally comes from two different places, if you will. One is lack of knowledge, right? Whether or not it's at the individual community or even sort of the, let's say, the large scientific community. As we improve our understanding of physical processes, whatever, we improve the models and the mechanisms that we use to make predictions. but we will never know everything. And so there will always be some level of uncertainty that's due to that lack of knowledge. But the other part of the uncertainty area is there are processes, or there are things in life that are just inherently unpredictable, and it's got nothing to do with our knowledge. And so, you have to decide which one of those two types is really the right thing to tackle in a particular discussion, manuscript or whatever. Um, and so that many problems. I mean, the weather is the perfect example that we experience every single day. I mean, our weather models are very, very good, but they're not perfect. And when they get a forecast wrong, that's when you hear about how bad they are. We don't ever really talk about how good they are. They've gotten better and better over the last decades to the point where it's pretty phenomenal. But we will never be able to predict the weather two weeks out. So the climate side of that question has a similar kind of problem, although the timescales are a lot longer, and it's very hard to get people to think about timescales that are a little bit longer than the weather timescale, your daily weather scale. So I think the challenge really is, figuring out what people's pain points, if you will, or communities' pain points are, and figuring out ways of talking about how uncertainty, either one of those, factors into their specific problems or specific concerns. It doesn't do a lot of good to talk about, the statistics of uncertainty in a context where people don't have A, the background, or B, the interest. They might have a more fundamental question. So, we need to figure out also how to talk about elements of uncertainty and science in general that don't challenge, essentially parts of community makeup that are not scientific. I mean, they're human, and it's, again, we have to figure out how to do that, I think, even better. And I think we've made a huge amount of progress as a community. I mean, just focusing on the coast of North Carolina, we did a flood insurance study for FEMA for North Carolina, and that was a really contentious, outcome, because it changed people's rates. It changed how much they have to pay for the government to back up, their federally backed mortgage. So there's a huge communication cell there that is challenging, and not necessarily because people don't believe the statistics, is they don't want their have to spend more on insurance. And so, that is a real challenge. And so that really goes down to the types of uncertainty that we can tackle reasonably versus what we have to just say, it's just random. So it's a hard problem, but I think we make a lot of progress sort of every time we get into those conversations. But some of those conversations are very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I definitely believe that. All right, well, thank you. So next question is to Julie. We have already been discussing a lot of ideas, and we will obviously continue to discuss more throughout the rest of the webinar. But how might we incorporate some of these ideas into graduate school curriculum to create a future where scientists are ready and able to engage with the public amicably? And then kind of what about the idea of like K through 12 curriculum as well?
Great questions. There are probably many answers. And, I think I'm going to get back to the training piece, just making and helping students understand that we need to understand science, but also be able to communicate it to the general population, because everybody comes in with different ideas and has a different background and different knowledge. And so in graduate school and even K through 12 school, we're trying to teach information. These are the facts you need to know. But then when you get to graduate school, you're also trying to learn, well, how do I interpret this? And then how do I go to the next step? Where's the whole, what's missing? What else do I need to know? And with my participatory science projects, it's been really valuable talking to the public and just engaging the community and saying, here's what we know. And then often I'll get questions back. Well, what does that mean about my health? And I'll say, well, I don't know yet. I can tell you X and Y, but I don't always know the other downstream steps. And I think that's the other challenge of how do you communicate some of this information when you don't always know all of the complete answer. So I think graduate schools are doing a lot right now. There's some opportunities where they have graduate students doing this 3-minute thesis, so 3MT. And so getting students to say, okay, here's your research project. Let's take your, 5 or 6 years of research that you've done and now explain it to the general audience in 3 minutes. How do you do that? And so those can be really challenging, but all really awesome. Some of the students come up with some really great opportunities and great ways to engage. And so those are some examples. I'll put some other examples in the chat. And you can create videos about your research. And so as a scientist, also, if you're doing, you write a paper, you can create a video about that and kind of explain it. Well, if I were explaining this to, one of my parents who doesn't have a science background, how would I explain that? And so go through that as an example, create a video that can be posted. So one of my colleagues at the museum has an ant lab, and he has done that a lot. And it's been really, really valuable. So those are great ways, getting some of these opportunities, getting training is going to be really valuable. K through 12, I think going into schools and just explaining, hey, I'm a scientist, this is what I do. Again, creating this conversation. I think as Cassandra was saying, you go into a community, how do you create a conversation and get feedback from that community about what they need or what they perceive? And that might help shift, how you approach some of your research in the future. So it's, again, a two-way street. So it's not just, telling everybody what to say, but really getting some of that training and experience. And I will say, as I communicate my science, the more I do it, the better I am. And so if I haven't done it in a while, I get rusty. And so you need to continue to do that. It's not just oh, I took this course and I have this credential, I'm great at it. You have to continuously do it to gain experience and get more opportunities. So just keeping that available and open is great.
Wonderful. Thank you. 3-minute thesis sounds terrifying, but interesting too. All right. Well, I appreciate that. Cassandra, next question's for you. What specific strategies have you found most effective for building trust with local communities? And I know we've kind of covered this, but I think, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. So in a few of my studies, we were interested in like understanding how can federal agencies improve trust. And so what we did, what the research told us, what we followed up with is that we see that NGOs or community and also community-based organizations have a much stronger relationship with building trust. So we went to them and we wanted to know what's in the secret recipe that we're all missing out on and you all have. So I said a little bit in the beginning, building trust, it takes time. You have to start building the relationship. And as it relates on my end around hazards, you can't build that. I don't want to say can't. It's much easier to build that relationship before the hazard is even in the equation. Um, there's a question that I typically ask my students often, and I ask myself, and it's really who's missing from the conversation. Typically, we all have our own bias, we all have our own positionality. Like from this panel, I'm probably the only person who is from Pittsburgh, who's raised in Pittsburgh, unless someone else raises their hand. But no, oh, you're from Pittsburgh? Oh my goodness. Hey, Randy. The chances. Well, raised in Pittsburgh, grew up and has German roots. Well, if you're from Pittsburgh, you probably have German roots. So never mind. This example does not work. But the idea is that we're coming from, we all bring a different, unique lens. And so I am more keen to certain types of things based on my background and recognizing that and owning that. It doesn't mean that I am I am identifying issues in myself. It's just recognizing that there is a strong possibility that I'm missing somebody else's voice. So really going back to who is missing from the conversation, who's not here. Um, I'm trying to think. I jotted some quick ones down. See community members as experts, right? Like it doesn't matter how much reading I've done, my team has done. It doesn't matter how much that we know about X community. We're not residents and we are not the experts. And so if you work with people and you treat them, if you come with a sense of deference, with a sense of humility and a sense of respect, you will go much farther. And I say all of this to also say that having a transactional relationship with a community member is also okay too. So understanding that you are, as long as the community member knows that you are bringing something to the table and that they are also bringing something to the table and there is an exchange, that's fine. But yeah, continue to look at the experts, continue to look at who's doing this really well, and speak to I feel like I can talk about this forever, but I won't. My last bit of piece is that, especially going to communities, I like to go to the shop that I see a lot of people at. So it might be the local um, bakery, or like the grandma shop, or if I see people sitting outside, or I love libraries. So I like to go to public spaces just to have conversations with folks and to just be respectful of a place that they call home. I feel like if you start out with respect, you can go much further.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry to ruin your example there for a second. So next question would be for Brian. How can research teams work together to make science more understandable, transparent, and trusted?
Yeah, and my answer to this actually is related to what Cassandra just said toward the end, and it's to get out and talk, right? It's you know, find forum, put yourself in uncomfortable, unfamiliar yet more community focused situations where you have to think about how you communicate science or some outcomes, right? And you want to get challenged, and you want to be prepared to change people's minds about things. And therefore, you got to be simple in a sense, right? And that's not derogatory, but simple graphics, right, that convey essential messages are critical in many cases. I mean, you don't want to show equations, you don't want to show distributions of error or losses or whatever like that. Because they just don't resonate unless you have some lay experts, if you will, in the audience. So again, being careful with what you show people or communities, and get out and talk about it, get beat up a little bit, and try to change people's minds.
Brandy, can
Awesome.
I add something to that thought?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say that as kind of a conduit and looking at new funding opportunities for these interdisciplinary teams, it's so important what Brian was saying. It's so important to be simple, because even researchers in different disciplines are not speaking the same language, let alone to the sponsor or to the general public. So brevity, clarity, these things are so crucial as we're articulating opportunities for solutions-based grants and awards.
Yeah, I mean, I
Definitely.
think it was Einstein maybe that said, make things simple but not simpler, right? I mean,
Yep.
and so there is a floor that you don't want to go below, because
Yes.
you certainly don't want to come off condescending and preaching and teaching, right? So you really do want to communicate as one-to-one as possible.
We have a series where we profile different researchers here at Carolina called Research Uncovered, and the UNC is capitalized because we're cute. But one of the profile questions that we ask of everybody, undergraduate, tenure professor, is to articulate your research in 5 words, distill it down to 5 words. And so talk about the challenge of a 3-minute thesis. Explaining your research in 5 words is a true challenge, but we get the most creative responses for that. And it really resonates across social media, where the attention span is that of a goldfish. It works really well.
Right. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So one more before we head over to everybody's questions that are in the audience. I'm going to address this one to Julie. You've worked at the museum. So with your experiences at the museum, I feel like you've probably been in contact with the community a good deal. Can you share an example of how community feedback has fundamentally changed the direction or methodology of your research?
Sure. It's a great question, and it was a little surprising to me as a researcher who didn't get trained in graduate school as somebody who engaged communities. And so, multiple projects I've engaged the public in some of these participatory science projects. Also at the museum, I would routinely go to certain scientific events at the museum and just engage different people. And the background of everyone is very different, but everyone who goes to the museum typically has some aspect where they're super excited about some of the research. And so one of the projects, I guess, that I'll talk about is my Monkey Health Explorer project. So that is looking at monkey health. And so we look at monkey health by collecting blood and then looking at the types of white blood cells that are in the monkey. And just like if you go to the doctor and get your blood drawn, the doctor's looking to see, you know, how many types of different white blood cells do you have, neutrophils, eosinophils, et cetera. Do you have more white blood cells than red blood cells? Maybe you have an infection, and then the type you have is telling you what kind of infection. So we would ask people on this platform's universe, which I can also put in the chat later. Hey, can you look at this blood smear from this monkey that lives in Puerto Rico, and then tell me, you know, which types of white blood cells you see, and then we'll kind of figure out what the monkey might be sick with or if it seems healthy. And what was really interesting is that we got a lot of comments from the public saying, hey, I was trained as a vet tech, and I see that your blood smear also has this basophilic stippling, and that could mean that your monkey has lead poisoning. So have you looked for lead poisoning in your population? And so it really opened up the door for us to realize, hey, we were asking, you know, the public to help us with question X. And we're getting all this additional information on something that we didn't even ask for and didn't realize that we could ask for because we weren't trained in, you know, looking at blood. And so it has been really valuable in shifting that project. And we still do our original questions, but now we're starting to shift and look more broadly at, you know, overall monkey health and get a lot of information from the public who has different training or different perspectives, and just kind of shifting what we're doing. And that's really teaching us, hey, we should go into schools and teach, you know, students that this is a really valuable project. You can get experience here that's really important for a vet school, medical school. And so again, we're, you know, asking the public to help us collect some data, but then we're trying to give back in some of these training mechanisms, and then also getting more insight about the overall project in general. So a lot of my projects, like I said, have that aspect, and it has been really a fun adventure. And so I thank all of the public who's contributed, and I hope we have a lot more great discussions in the future.
Very interesting. That's awesome that they were able to help like that. So I really appreciate that conversation. Now we kind of want to hear from the audience and ask their questions. So we're going to move to the Easy Retro board, which my colleague will share shortly, both visually on the screen and a link in chat for you guys. Just to give you a little bit of background on how Easy Retro works as we're getting going on this. In order to add a question, click on the plus sign in the relevant column, type your idea, and when you're finished, the blue box with a thin line or with a thin check mark, and that will say your response within the same field. Your idea will appear on the screen for the public's reaction. And then the other thing to keep in mind is you can upvote someone else's idea using the thumbs up icon, and you can comment on an idea that's already there by using the quotation bubble. And then just as we're getting started, I want to remind everybody again, we will likely not have time to get to all of these questions, but we will do our best to address questions as efficiently as possible. So please feel free to keep adding and upvoting questions throughout the duration of the discussion today. Okay, so we will head into Easy Retro. I will note that these questions are just going to be opened up to the entire group. So feel free to jump in, guys, as you see something that you'd like to answer. So we'll start with the question at the top of engagement and outreach. How can team science programs best demonstrate their value as compared to traditional programs? I think some of you have worked more in like research collaborations. It would be great to jump in on that if you have that experience.
I can take it from some of my museum projects, and since I talked about the Monkey Health Project, I will say that, you know, we're approaching that as collecting blood samples, looking at specific research questions about monkey health, and then connecting that back to other aspects, genetics, behavior, et cetera. But as I started talking to other people in the museum, I realized that there's a huge education component. And so, like I said, that got us into thinking more broadly in this team science realm of, hey, we need to bring educators on board to help us not only explain it better as we were talking to the public, but also go into schools and train students and get more feedback there. We talked to the vet in the museum and got them on board. And so we've now started looking at some of the animal health in the museum, looking at blood smears of those animals and connecting that back to this broader project. So again, looking at some of these questions from a broader aspect is giving us new insights, new training, and also new opportunities for funding and new ways to engage. So I think, you know, the team science, like really bringing everybody together, getting them all at the table and thinking about, well, what would be valuable to you and how can we make this more valuable to a broader community is really been a great asset to some of these projects.
And Brandy is someone that promotes and advocates for teams. I guess I'll say that the value and the benefit proposition that we always talk about is what these teams do collaboratively together. There are some solutions that can only be arrived at from a diversity of perspectives and disciplines. I mean, and especially for a data science audience, I mean, that it's so foundational across so many fields to accelerate solutions in this way. So I think maybe starting with what the goal and what we're trying to achieve is a good way to demonstrate value there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I will move on to the next question. We're going to go into the research column, and I'll just take the, so we have 3 questions that were merged together there, so that's why you see 3 questions in one box. I'll just go with what are some strategies for communicating research findings in an accessible way without compromising credibility?
So I can answer that question. So typically we have a number of ways that we distribute our findings or research findings. Depending on the funder and their request, we'll have a formal report. Something that we give out to the general public is a condensed, probably 2 or 3 pager, something very small that you can kind of go through with key findings, essentially a fancy version of an executive summary. But something that's very easily, I can pass this on, I can hand this out. We've also been doing some really kind of creative things lately where we worked with a photographer, Gary George, and so we've hosted kind of visual presentations where we put up and printed out his pictures and had discussions around those with the community. I've also done an art gallery, an interactive art gallery. I did a study a few years ago about the ways in which that COVID has impacted first-generation college students. And we created this interactive gallery for folks to participate in. The point of it is that we try to use as many different means that can engage different types of people. It's easy for me to sit down and write a bunch of words, but it breaks my heart knowing that not everyone is going to read from page to page. Like that's the reality of it. And so really trying to come up with interactive and interesting and alternative ways to share the research that ensures that it reaches the communities that we're working with, as well as the partners that we've developed, as well as the funders, and so that everyone has a sense of what's happening. I will mention it's incredibly time consuming. We have fantastic sets of editors that help us out through this journey, but I feel like that kind of communicative process has allowed us to continue to get funding because we're building trust with our funders. It's allowed us to continue to have access to communities that are typically closed off because we're showing good faith in our research. And it's allowing us to build new relationships with other communities because the other communities can say, hey, look, this is what they've done here. So that's a quick thing of the different ways that we have kind of distributed research in the past.
Wonderful, thank you. I do see a hand in our audience. I will say that we have things turned off so that you guys can't actually speak. But you are welcome to type into the chat, or again, you can enter things into this this board for us. If it's a comment on the question that was just answered, please feel free to click the comment button to post a comment there as well. And anybody is welcome to post comments. If you have thoughts on these things, please also feel free to add to them. So I will go to the next question now, which is in the miscellaneous column. Beyond analogies and visuals, what are other ways to connect general audiences to the fine details of science?
Well, I can respond to that. I'm not sure if it's an answer, but I'm not sure fine details and general audience go together, right? I mean, I think that that's actually part of the communication challenge. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people that are interested or communities that are interested in the fine details, but that's typically where things go astray, right? If you lose people immediately because you're in the fine details, you know, that I think erodes trust. It may not erode credibility, right? Because you probably come off sounding kind of smart, but the point is that that's not what people want to hear about. So it matters. The fine details matter once you overcome a couple of these big hurdles, and then as the community relationship evolves, right, and understanding is reached on multiple levels, you can potentially get into that. But I would be worried about fine details of science when we have a more fundamental communication barrier to get over first. So that's just my opinion.
And I'll just quickly, I just want to agree with Brian. Another method to use, I've used podcast, where you can kind of say, you could give like quick highlights of a research finding or a project. And then what you say at the end is something also you would say in an abridged version of your report. Hey, if you want to have the fine
Yeah.
details, or if you want to have more information, we have the full report with all of the graphs, all of the tables, and you can find this at this website. So at least it's still keeping that communication open, but absolutely the fine details is set for the, from my perspective, is set for the final report, where you have these other ways, such as a podcast, to provide information in a different way.
Yeah, and sort of generating the opportunity for a further conversation is the key step, right? I mean, you don't want to jump into it, but you got to say, look, let's get together and talk about these details anytime you want. Yeah.
And this is pretty simplistic, but I'm going to say it anyway. In my world, it's kind of our communication about research is the inverse of how research is conducted. So your study, the conclusion's at the bottom. In a press release, the conclusion is the headline. And that's what people are paying attention to. So we start there, and to the rest of the panelists' point, like, you dive deeper into kind of the depth of the research at the rest of the piece. And that's a way that we connect with our general audience.
Absolutely. I think headlines are everything for a lot of people sometimes. And then if they do get past the headline, the first paragraph becomes a very important piece, right? The details go further. All right. Thank you, guys. So the next question comes out of the engagement and outreach column. How do you counteract malicious misinformation about your research topic? It's a hard one, right?
I'll say something about this too. I mean, I've fortunately never had this happen, mostly because I think, focus on potentially controversial things. But one of the one strategy, and it's been done a lot, is to take people to court. In other words, if it's misinformation about research and it's sort of demonstrably incorrect, meaning the response, not the research. I mean, the perfect example is the climatologist Michael Mann, right? He has spent years in court, basically defending his reputation because his points are somewhat uncomfortable, even though fundamentally they're not controversial. So that's an extreme example, but at the same time, it's very helpful when the institution, is able to back up researchers that may be challenged in certain ways. And I'm not necessarily sure that immediately responding on social media is necessarily the best tactic, because that can spiral out of control rapidly. So I don't know what the answer to this is. I'm just saying that it really probably depends.
Awesome. Layla, do you have any insights as,
Yeah.
because you work in science communication, I think like maybe the communication side of that might have some to do with it as well.
Sure. Misinformation in general. I mean, we are encountering that at the broadest, highest level right now, right? And I think something to keep in mind when you're engaging with audiences is you're not gonna convert everybody, right? It's a spectrum. And maybe there are people on both the outer parts of both sides of that spectrum that you're never going to completely convince that your science is true and accurate. And that's okay, because most of the reasonable, rational people live in the space between. So our approach right now is to talk about impact and what the research is doing, what the science is doing for the people of the state that have invested in it, and the people of the country and the world that have also invested in it in some way. And, you know, highlighting at the broadest level possible has been really advantageous for us right now in this current climate. So we're engaging with people that have not been traditionally our most vocal supporters, but they understand when we're talking about when you remove this funding or you get rid of, you know, this specific discipline, the ripple effect there, including student opportunities in the future and training the next generation of our workforce. The kind of, and you know, we've said this in different ways, but just meeting these folks where they're at and what resonates with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I've worked in science communication too, so I'm going to insert a thought here as well. I think much to your point of like meeting people where they are, it's letting the communities know how the research actually impacts them. A lot of times helps clarify some of that misinformation, like this impacts you this way. This is why this is important. Because then people have a reason to be engaged in it and a reason to understand it. So. I will go ahead and do one more question, and we will go to how can universities support scientific communication?
I can jump in real quick and just say, you know, we try to, but we could do a better job. And one thing we kind of touched on this earlier in the conversation. One thing that I would like to see us do a better job are collecting metrics beyond page views, engagements on social media. What is the actual impact of this research in either the communities that it serves or some tangential opportunity that we weren't even expecting? Like we profiled a professor who then had an inundation of graduate applicants for that lab because they were so inspired by their story. And then, you know, extramural funding that comes through when we talk about a seed project, you know, things like that we need to do a better job of.
Helps if I unmute myself, right? Any other thoughts on that one? All right. Well, I do think that's all the time we have for right now. So before we leave, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We certainly appreciate our panelists and their time and attention. As always, we will be sending out a link to the webinar recording by email, so you may be able to view it within a few days. Please take a moment to provide feedback when we wrap up in a moment, and stay tuned for information about our next ACTS webinar. We look forward to seeing you there. My colleague Jessica is going to go ahead and quickly share the link to join our mailing list in the Zoom chat. Sign up and stay tuned to learn more about our lineup for 2025. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you all.